I didn't raise my voice. Not once. When my daughter told me I was being a stubborn, old fool in front of her husband, in my own kitchen, standing right next to the table I built with my own hands 30 years ago, I just nodded slowly and said, "Maybe you're right." And I meant it as something she'd never understand until much later. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I'm 58 years old. I run a small hardware store in Bend, Oregon. And for most of my adult life, the people who loved me thought they knew exactly what I was worth. My daughter. I'll call her my daughter because that's what she is. Even now, her name is Fiona. She married a man named Curtis about 4 years ago. Nice enough looking. Good at shaking hands. The kind of man who talks about opportunities a lot without ever explaining what he actually does. Her mother, my ex-wife Renata, passed away 6 years ago. Breast cancer. It was fast in the end. And the grief was the kind that doesn't leave clean. It just becomes part of the furniture. After Renata died, Fiona and I got closer for a while. She'd come by the store on Saturdays. We'd get coffee at the place down the block. For about a year, I thought we were going to be okay, just the two of us. Then she married Curtis. I want to be fair here, because fair matters to me. Curtis didn't turn my daughter into someone cold. The coldness was always there, waiting. He just gave it permission. The first sign was small. Christmas 2 years ago, I'd given Fiona an envelope with $2,000 inside, something I'd done every year since she turned 18. She opened it, looked at it and said, "Dad, is this really all you could manage?" Curtis laughed a little, like it was charming of her to say out loud what they'd both been thinking. I didn't say anything. I just folded my napkin and asked if anyone wanted more sweet potatoes. The second sign came about 6 months later. Curtis mentioned, casually, over dinner, that they were looking at investment properties, and that it would be smart for me to think about liquidating some assets while the market was good. I asked him what assets he had in mind. He gestured vaguely at the air and said, "Well, the store, eventually. You're not going to run it forever, right?" I told him I planned to run it until I couldn't stand up straight. He smiled like that was the most adorable thing he'd ever heard. I own the building the hardware store operates in. I bought it in 1999 for $214,000. It sits on Main Street in Bend, Oregon. And if you've been paying any attention to what Bend's real estate market has done over the last 15 years, you already know where this is going. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The third sign was the one that told me everything. I'd been having some chest pain. Turned out to be acid reflux, nothing serious. But for a few weeks in the spring, I was going to a cardiologist and getting tests done. I mentioned it to Fiona on the phone, more to explain why I'd missed her call than anything else. She went very quiet. Then she said, "Dad, have you thought about getting your affairs in order? Like, legally? Curtis knows an estate attorney." I said, "I'm not dying, sweetheart. It's heartburn." She said, "I'm just being practical." That's when I started paying attention. Really paying attention. I didn't let on. That's the part I'm most proud of, looking back. I didn't get angry, didn't get hurt, didn't change anything visible on the surface. I just started watching. I started listening to what she said and, more importantly, what she didn't say. I started noticing the questions Curtis asked when he thought he was being subtle. How much did I owe on the building? Was it in my name alone, or did it go through the business? Did I have a will? I told him the will was something I'd been meaning to get around to. He nodded seriously, like this was a great concern to him personally, what I did not tell him. What I had not told anyone in my immediate family because it had never come up and because I am a private person by nature, was that the building on Main Street was not the only property I owned. In 2003, my buddy Walt, we'd known each other since high school, Walt came to me with a problem. He and his wife were behind on a duplex they'd bought out in Redmond, about 20 minutes east of Bend. They needed a partner to buy in and help carry the mortgage, or they were going to lose it. I bought a 50% stake for $62,000. We never made a big deal of it. Walt's name was on the management side, mine was in the paperwork, and the rent checks came in like clockwork every month. I never mentioned it to Renata because it happened after she got sick, and I never mentioned it to Fiona because there was never a reason to. In 2011, Walt and I bought another one, a 4-unit apartment building in Redmond, same arrangement. In 2017, Walt retired to Florida and sold me his stakes in both properties at a price that was fair to both of us, because that's how Walt and I operated. By the time Fiona started asking questions about my affairs, I owned 3 rental properties in Central Oregon, the duplex, the 4-unit, and a single-family house I'd picked up in 2019 when a tenant of mine needed to sell fast. The combined current market value, I'd had them appraised the previous fall, was just over $2.3 million, plus the store building, which a commercial real estate agent had told me without me asking, was worth somewhere between $1.6 and $1.9 million, depending on the buyer. I was, on paper, a man worth close to $4 million. I wore the same Carhartt jacket I'd had for 9 years. I drove a 2016 Ford F-150 with a crack in the passenger side mirror. I ate lunch at the same diner every day and tipped $3 because the coffee was good, and the waitress remembered my order. My daughter thought I was a stubborn old man with a hardware store who was sitting on potential she could help me realize. I let her think that. In July, the chest pain came back, real this time. Not heartburn. The cardiologist found a partial blockage, and I had a stent put in. It's a routine procedure now, people do it every day. But when you're lying on that table and they're threading a wire into your heart, routine feels like a word other people use. I was in the hospital for 3 days. Fiona came, which I appreciated. Curtis came too, which I noticed. On the second day, Curtis sat next to my bed while Fiona was getting coffee and said very gently, "I hope this is a wake-up call, Dad, for planning purposes." Fiona worries. I told him it was good to have family who worried. He said, "We've actually spoken to an attorney, just exploratorily, about power of attorney arrangements. For medical decisions, and for financial ones too. Just in case. Would you be open to that conversation?" I said. "Let me get home first, and we'll sit down like adults." He squeezed my arm like I'd said yes. I came home. I did not sit down like adults. Instead, I called my own attorney, a man I've worked with for 20 years, real estate law mostly, name of Howard Briggs, out of Bend. I told Howard everything, the properties, the store building, what Curtis had said in the hospital room, the pattern I'd been tracking for the better part of a year. Howard listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I pay him for. When I finished, Howard said, "Do you want to protect the assets, or do you want to teach a lesson?" I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, "Both, if possible." Howard said, "Both is possible." Over the next 6 weeks, we restructured everything. The rental properties went into a limited liability company, Cascade Holdings, LLC, with me as the sole managing member. The store building went into a separate trust, structured so that any transfer would require 2 independent appraisals and a 90-day notice period. My will was updated to reflect what I actually wanted, not what someone might assume I wanted. While I was doing all of this, I gave Fiona and Curtis absolutely no indication that anything had changed. I called Fiona on Sundays like always. I complained about my knee like always. I mentioned once that I'd finally talked to someone about the will situation, and that it was pretty much sorted. Curtis, when I mentioned this to him at a dinner in August, looked like a man who'd just been told the restaurant had his reservation. In September, Curtis called me with what he described as a time-sensitive opportunity. A developer was interested in the block where my store sat. Not just my building, the whole block, but my building was the anchor property. If I wanted to be part of a sale, now was the time. The developer was offering $3 million for my building as part of a package deal. I asked Curtis how he'd heard about this. He said he'd been doing research on the Bend commercial market. I said, "Who's the developer?" He gave me a name. I wrote it down. I said, Send me whatever you have in writing. He emailed me a 2-page letter that evening. I forwarded it to Howard within 10 minutes. Howard called me back the next morning and said, "This developer is real, the offer is real, and it's actually low by about $400,000. But more importantly, how did your son-in-law know about this? I've been working on Bend commercial properties for 30 years and this deal wasn't public." That was the question, wasn't it? It took Howard about a week to find out. Curtis had met the developer at a networking event 3 months earlier. He pitched them on the idea that an aging owner, his words, apparently, might be motivated to sell quickly, given recent health issues. He had represented, in conversation if not in writing, that he had influence over my decision-making. He had been, in effect, positioning himself as a middleman between me and a sale I didn't know I was being set up for. I want to pause here for a second, because I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like I should have been furious, and somewhere deep down I was. But fury is loud, and loud people make mistakes. I had learned over 58 years of being a quiet man in a noisy world that the most effective thing you can do when someone underestimates you is let them keep doing it for just a little while longer. So I called Curtis back, and I said I was thinking about it. I said the number seemed low, but that I was open to the conversation. I asked if he thought we should get the family together to discuss it, since it was a big decision. He said that sounded like a wonderful idea. We set a date, first Saturday of October, my house. Curtis invited the developer. He said it would be efficient to have everyone in the same room. I said that sounded fine. I called Howard and told him to be there. I called Walt in Florida and asked him if he'd be willing to make a trip up, just for the weekend. Walt said absolutely, like I'd known he would. I also made a few calls I didn't tell Curtis about. The Saturday arrived cold and bright. One of those October days in Oregon where the sky is so blue it almost looks fake. Curtis and Fiona arrived first. Curtis was wearing a blazer, which he never did on weekends. Fiona looked nervous in a way I hadn't seen before, like she already knew the shape of something she couldn't quite see yet. The developer arrived about 10 minutes later. His name was Greg Sutton, late 40s, fit, the kind of man who's good at reading rooms. He shook my hand and looked around my living room with the practiced disinterest of someone who's appraising everything. Howard arrived last. Curtis saw Howard come in, and his expression shifted just slightly. Not panic, not yet, just a recalibration. He said, "I didn't know you were bringing legal." I said, "Howard's been my attorney for 20 years. Felt like the right occasion. We sat down. Greg Sutton laid out the proposal cleanly and professionally. $3 million for the building. 30-day close, clean title transfer. He clearly knew his business. I let him finish. Then I said, "I appreciate the presentation, Greg. Before we go further, I want to make sure everyone in the room has the same information. Howard, do you want to walk us through the ownership structure?" Howard opened his folder. He explained Cascade Holdings, LLC. He explained the trust. He explained that any sale of the store building would require, under the terms of the trust, 2 independent appraisals, one of which had already been completed, placing the value at $3,400,000, plus a 90-day minimum notice period that had not yet been initiated. He explained that I had, 2 months earlier, received an independent offer for the building at $3,200,000 from a separate buyer, which I had declined because I was not currently interested in selling. The room was quiet. Then Howard said, "We also want to address something related to how this meeting came to happen." He looked at Curtis. It appears that in preliminary conversations with the development group, certain representations were made about the owner's decision-making capacity and receptiveness to a below-market offer. We'd like those representations clarified, in writing, today, because depending on their nature, they may constitute a breach of fiduciary duty, or, in a worst-case reading, an attempted elder financial exploitation under Oregon statute. Greg Sutton looked at Curtis. Not angry. Professional. the look of a man who does not want to be anywhere near whatever this is becoming. Curtis said, "I was just trying to help." I said very quietly, "Help who?" That's the question he didn't have an answer for. Fiona had gone completely still on the couch beside him. She wasn't looking at me, she was looking at her hands. Greg Sutton excused himself about 5 minutes later. He was polite about it, gave me his card, said if I ever did want to revisit a sale to call him directly. I respected that. After he left, the four of us, me, Fiona, Curtis, Howard, sat in my living room for another 40 minutes. It wasn't a shouting match. I wouldn't have allowed that. It was, mostly, a conversation where I asked questions and Curtis talked himself in circles trying to explain a story that didn't have a good explanation. The core facts as they emerged: Curtis had been in contact with Greg Sutton's development group since June. He had told them I was recovering from a cardiac procedure and might be willing to move quickly. He had suggested, though apparently not promised, that he could facilitate the transaction. He had not told me any of this. He had not told Fiona the full extent of it, either, which, to be honest, was the thing that stunned her more than anything else. He'd been playing both sides of the family simultaneously. I looked at Fiona when Curtis finally ran out of things to say. She was crying, quietly, in the way she'd cried at her mother's funeral. Controlled, like she'd decided how much she was allowed to feel. I said, "I'm not angry with you." She said, "You should be." I said, "Maybe. But you're my daughter. That doesn't stop." I did not say the same thing to Curtis. Howard, before he left, handed Curtis a letter. It outlined what had happened, what the legal exposure might look like, and what Curtis needed to do. Specifically, a written statement to Greg Sutton's company clarifying that he had no authority to represent my interests, and a commitment not to contact any potential buyers related to my properties going forward. If Curtis signed it, we wouldn't pursue the matter further. If he didn't, Howard would be making some additional calls. Curtis signed it that afternoon. He didn't negotiate. He barely read it. I walked them to the door when they left. Fiona hugged me in the driveway. I could feel how tight she was holding on, like she was apologizing without words. Curtis shook my hand. I let him. Walt came over that evening. We sat on the back porch with cold beer and watched the light go off the Cascades. He asked me how I felt. I told him I felt tired. He said that was fair. We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. Fiona called me 3 days later. She said she'd asked Curtis to move out temporarily while she figured out what she wanted. She didn't ask for my opinion on that, which I respected. She just told me because she thought I should know. I told her I was there whenever she wanted to talk. I told her I was proud of her for the way she'd sat in that room and faced something hard without running from it. She asked me why I hadn't told her about the properties, about the real picture. I thought about that for a moment before I answered. I said, "Because I wanted you to love me for who I was, not for what I had. Your mother and I built everything we had on that principle. When you started asking questions about my estate before I was even out of the hospital, I realized you hadn't quite learned it yet." She was quiet on the phone for a long time. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "I know, sweetheart. The hardware store is still open. The building is still mine. The rentals are doing well. Vacancy rate in Central Oregon is low, and I have a good property manager who handles the day-to-day. Howard drafted a proper estate plan that reflects what I actually want, and it has nothing to do with anyone's timeline but mine. Curtis and Fiona are still working through it. I don't know what they'll decide. That's not my story to tell. What I'll tell you is this. I spent a lot of years being quiet, being steady, being the man in the Carhartt jacket who fixed your plumbing aisle and knew where the weird bolts were kept. People look at a man like that and they see a ceiling. They see what he has, not what he built. They see the last chapter, and they think they know the whole book. The smile people ask me about. The one I had on my face when Greg Sutton was packing up his presentation and Curtis was realizing the room had shifted on him. That smile wasn't about winning. It wasn't about money. It was about 35 years of quiet work finally speaking for itself, in a language everyone in the room could understand. There's a moment, and I think about it more than I expected to, when Curtis looked across my living room at Howard's open folder and realized the room had shifted under him. Not dramatically. No one raised their voice. The developer quietly packed his presentation. Fiona went still, and Curtis, who had spent months positioning himself as the man who understood opportunity, sat there with nothing left to position. That moment didn't happen by accident. It happened because of choices, his, mine, and every small decision that compounded over decades into something neither of us could have fully predicted. I've thought a lot about what led Curtis to that table. I don't think he was born calculating. I think he was a man who learned somewhere along the way that the fastest path between 2 points was through whoever happened to be standing there. When he looked at me, he saw a shortcut. A man in a worn jacket, recovering from a heart procedure, with a store he'd run for 30 years. He saw the ending of something, not the depth of it. That's a failure of character, but it's also a failure of attention. He never asked who I was. He only asked what I had. What I had, and what he never bothered to understand, was time. 35 years of quiet, steady work, of buying things when they were unglamorous and holding them when everyone else was distracted. Of trusting Walt's handshake over a document because I knew his character and he knew mine. None of that looked like much from the outside. That was always the point. I think about the 3 things that made the difference in my life, and they don't have fancy names. The first is simply doing right by people, even when no one's watching. Paying a fair price. Keeping a promise. Tipping the waitress who remembers your order, not because it earns you anything directly, but because it becomes who you are, and who you are eventually becomes your circumstances. Howard didn't show up that Saturday because I paid him well. He showed up because in 20 years I had never once asked him to do something that wasn't straight. The second is thinking clearly when emotion wants to take the wheel. When Fiona asked me in that hospital room about getting my affairs in order, everything in me wanted to be hurt, and I was hurt. But hurt men make loud mistakes, and loud mistakes hand power to the people trying to take it. I thought instead. I watched instead. I let the picture get complete before I acted, and the complete picture was far more useful than any argument I could have started in that hospital bed. The third is just not stopping. The duplex in 2003 wasn't glamorous. Neither was the 4-unit in 2011. I fixed a leaky faucet myself at a rental property at age 54 because the repair bill seemed unreasonable. None of it felt like building an empire. It felt like Tuesday. But Tuesdays are what empires are made of. Fiona called me last Sunday. We talked for almost an hour. About her mother, about the store, about what she wants the next few years to look like. She didn't ask about my assets. She asked how my knee was holding up. That's the only inheritance that ever mattered to me.